Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the USS Crow. Its 5-year mission to seek out new life and new civilizations beyond the Romulan Star Empire, to foster peaceful contact and support resistance to acts of terror and oppression, to defend those who cannot defend themselves. Using the 2D20 system from Modiphius for Star Trek adventures, our crew of 5 players and 1 game master will seek out what it means to be human in all the contexts the galaxy allows. Those viewers already familiar with this channel will know what to expect. This will be a series which combines recaps, post-play reflections, and commentary on the system, how we used it, and what's in the book that caused us problems and might cause other people problems. So, at this stage of the game, we've had our session 0. We've had a meeting to create the characters. And then we gave everyone time to pause and reflect. They took a week. They went away. They finished their characters. They discussed with each other ways that those characters could better connect or create some plausible and interesting tensions. Then we sat down for our first session, but nature got in the way there a little bit. In between session 0 and session 1, 2 of our players, well, they had to transport out as their second child was delivered basically on the day we were supposed to play. None of the rest of us take it personally, but you know, this will be a story that gets told to young Lockwood Norman in the future. His brother Reginald wasn't born on a game day. Anyway, foregoing taking sides in any future sibling rivalry, the group that we have assembled is made up of 3 members from our ongoing Star Wars campaign, and 2 people that I haven't played with before, and the others haven't played with much before. So we have this new group dynamic to sort out, and we're getting our heads into playing Star Trek. So the decision that we made for character creation was to go through the life path system, and I led this so that it could be as collaborative as possible while also hitting on system points. This was a good way for me to see what had sunk in, and it was a good way to direct attention at possibilities and pick up on good linkages that started to appear, good connective tissue between the characters, and which parts of the setting that I was putting forward as my interests were gelling with everybody else. So let's talk about that a little bit. I mentioned in an earlier video that I wanted to do original series Trek. People that I'm playing with, they mostly think of Star Trek as the next generation. Everybody's seen a lot of everything. We don't have any huge Star Trek fans, but we have a lot of people who enjoy the franchise in its different incarnations. It seemed easiest and best to go with the next generation. With all that in mind, we went for being a ship's crew, and that ship would be a primarily exploratory vessel with some opportunities for danger and intrigue, investigation, that sort of thing. But there's hesitation about being the command crew. So we sort of split the difference and went with crew members with very specific areas of responsibility. And these would be the crew members that we decided on this vessel will be the ones tasked with away missions, with first contact missions, with solving those mysterious alien puzzles and whatnot, but would also be directly involved in any acts of war that happen to crop up, with this background thing I had growing in my mind that I really wanted to do something with the Romulans. But this is the next generation. People have seen most of the next generation. People have seen parts of Voyager. People have seen parts of Deep Space Nine. Where exactly are we going to set it? And how can we have something involving exploration and the Romulans and the idea of the Prime Directive? And these ideas are all out there. What are we going to do? We'll get to that part later. The group session involving all the players and getting all the characters built. One guy, David, you'll remember from the Star Wars recaps, he commented that He'd never done a more complicated character creation session, but it also hadn't had one that was as much fun. And life paths do tend to have that reaction on people when they see them for the first time. How they can spark all these different ideas, how they can lead you to create a character that you might not have done otherwise. We ended up with a lot of good character ideas at the end of that session 0, but we also ended up with a lot of confusion. What exactly should I do? Without everyone having a copy of the book or having a copy of the PDF available as we were sitting around the table, what we were left with was notes that I'd given them, my descriptions, and the character sheets, and going through in order. Glad to see that everybody got through character creation in that kind of chaotic environment. We're once again in the coffee shop doing this, so we're talking over music and everything else. But the characters I got back worked, and they were interesting, and they'll make a dynamic part of an interesting crew, which will also see us accessing the supporting character rules in Star Trek Adventures quite often. In Session 1 had that happen a little bit more often than I wanted, but on the bright side, I guess you could say, everybody is now clear on what it is, and how it keeps them involved in what's going on. But to stay with Session 0, if I were to run a character creation session with a group like this again, I would want to have more copies of the book available to limit or help to limit any confusion that going through an unfamiliar process can create. However, there's only so far that can take you, and the Game Master does need to be prepared to deal with the confusion and the hesitation which will arise, because unlike some of its sister games, and unlike a lot of games on the market, what Star Trek Adventures asks you to do a lot on the fly is make stuff up and feel confident about it. Specific areas where you can find hesitation and uncertainty building up are in the area of focuses for your disciplines and in the concept of values. Now, in both of these cases, there are a lot of examples given, and they start to make sense in context when you start thinking about things that you have heard people say in a Star Trek episode, that sort of thing. And it should be easy, but it's also understandable that it might not be. And the part of it really that is difficult is feeling confident that what you have created as a value or what you've identified as a focus is reasonable. And without play, you have no idea if it is reasonable, if it encapsulates enough of an idea for a value, or if it's appropriately useful yet vague for a focus. So it's a leap of faith. This is the kind of leap of faith that I enjoy. But I totally get why it would be daunting or confusing or frustrating, or at least produce hesitation and uncertainty, as I've said, in others. So I am really going to enjoy this game. I like how it phrases its characters. I like how it frames its characters so that the system that they've created will allow you to, in concert with the players, create the feel of a Star Trek episode. And that is something that needs to be recognized from the get-go. This is a role-playing game that very specifically is encouraging the creation of the feeling of participating in an episode of television. The way that character action will interact with system mechanics creates this feel. It's very interesting. And it positions the experience of play in different parts of the creative and collaborative process than you might be used to. So there is a learning curve here for actual play. So there's a learning curve of what is the system itself, how does 2D20 work as a basic framework, how does this iteration of 2D20 work, what new jargon has been applied to common system elements, what new elements have been created specifically for this, and how have they been adjusted to fit together. So I find reading through the mechanics and reading through the core book to produce a sense of a Star Trek episode. I'm not entirely sure that were I a player, not the game master, just a dedicated player through a campaign, I'm not sure how often I would get what I personally want from roleplay from this system, but I am certain that I'm going to have very satisfying games and sessions and campaigns that feel like Star Trek. So it really is an interesting position that I find myself in, and I'm looking forward to seeing how my opinion evolves through play. In terms of being the game master, there are fewer things which are going to affect my experience in terms of my biases as a player. A lot of the things that I normally have to do as a game master, I now will be able to do through system, which means once we become comfortable with it, there'll actually be less talking on my part to do some of the things that I normally do. And I like that a lot. So I may find the game mastering side of this version of 2D20 to be more satisfying than some other games that I really like. So I feel that as we move forward with this kind of design philosophy, I may want to be the game master of games like this more often than I want to play them, and I'll want to play the games that I really like right now much more often as a player rather than as a game master. But we'll see what happens. So let's move on to Session 1. Session 1 was set up as a Shakedown Cruise for the post-refit trials and testing of all the new systems that are in the USS Crow. I kind of like the Cheyenne Class ship, and I like the idea of the dramatic elements that I can draw from a less common type of ship that was used as a prototype or as a test bed for other more successful ships. So it's sort of a class of ship which is lost or shrouded in history. It has some very unusual design features. It has 4 nacelles. What can this allow us to get into? What kind of impact can this have on the different departments in the ship or the different challenges the ship can face? What might be more difficult? What might be less difficult? And that sort of thing. So in an effort to make our Trek feel a little different, I liked that design choice. So I've installed them on this Cheyenne Class cruiser, and I've interpreted the cruiser the way that I want to get the most out of the Star Trek Adventures system using the ship design rules, which means I had to invent my own space frame and that sort of thing. But that was quite easy after we got through character creation. It all made sense, all fit together. It didn't take a lot of time, except the amount of time that I chose to spend researching other people's take on this class of ship and drawing from them what inspiration I could, then kind of putting it together in a stew pot and boiling off all the things that weren't working for me or weren't gelling with the characters. So what we got left, I'm pretty satisfied, is a ship that the characters that were created can find something interesting to do on, and there'll be some interesting shipborne, I don't want to say conflict, but I guess tension that will occupy a space kind of between everybody's ridiculously friendly Next Generation kind of writer's guideline versus the situation that we have in Deep Space Nine, where there's a lot of almost open conflict to actual open conflict. So somewhere in between there. It will be a harmonious ship that can work together in adverse circumstances. But different departments will want to pull in different directions. And I keep coming back to the idea between what the captain wants in the original series, what Kirk wants from his ship, doesn't always mesh well with what Scotty's prepared to deliver. But when push comes to shove, they work together and they make it happen. So, Session 1 is our Shakedown Cruise, which means that all the senior staff of the Cheyenne, they're now on leave, and the junior officers are put in charge of of conducting this cruise, and they're given a course to follow and certain objectives. And one of the objectives is that they're to attempt to achieve the emergency top speed that the ship has been rated for. And the way the orders are written, it was implied that they would carry out all these other tests, sensor tests and whatnot, work together as a crew, and then, warp home at top speed. Well, the crew did this in a completely reverse order. Our XO player decided, well, if we got to do this, let's do it now, and called for emergency warp speed as the very first act once they cleared space dock. So that was entertaining, and it brought us straight into the drama. Now, as I mentioned earlier, 2 of the players were supposed to be there, and it wasn't until the actual day of play that we knew that they weren't going to be there. So the situations that I had in mind for how I wanted to demonstrate very specific mechanics that we would have to use a lot, they're very fresh in my mind, but now I'm thinking, well, the balance of players is suddenly very different. For example, our security officer is gone. Our primary engineering, not exactly an engineer, but primary engineering character is gone, which leaves us with the XO, the science officer, and the medical officer. There's an awful lot of the shipboard stuff which is suddenly less relevant to the number of players as a whole. What should I do? Well, I decided that showcasing some of the secondary characters' mechanics would be a good thing to do, because I want that to happen. I want them to be talking to crew members. I want the ship to feel full, and the only way that's going to happen is if we slowly over time build a cast of secondary characters. What I didn't want to do is push a main character completely out of the spotlight, because there was nothing for them to do. So I was only partially successful in that. Every character was active during the session. A lot of secondary characters were active during the session, and some values were tested. So in terms of what I wanted to accomplish in the session, I was pretty satisfied. In terms of the content, the story content of the session, I was pretty satisfied. I was less satisfied in how I managed to make the events of the session matter to each of the characters. Another area where I was satisfied is we all seemed quite comfortable with each other, and a thing that gave me great amusement was that we had multiple generations of Microsoft Surface tablets on the table. So it kind of felt like I was original series using my original Surface, and then we have a later Surface, and then we have the most recent Surface all out on the table. So that was a hoot. And I kept looking over at the most recent one and wishing that I could upgrade in some way. So we go from the original Enterprise to the Enterprise B or something. But anyway, the session itself saw a dynamic erupt between the bridge crew and the engineering crew. And the challenges that had been placed before the engineering crew were not ones that they could solve on their own. They would need to get involved with other departments. And the security threat to the ship, I expected to become obvious very early. It happened very late, which gave us a good way to end. So I was pretty satisfied with that. But in a nutshell, what happened was they attempted to reach the emergency warp speed. They didn't come anywhere close to it, and they recognized that were they to keep trying, there would be a very catastrophic event. So they stopped, and they began to figure out what's wrong with the warp engines. That was the task they set for themselves. So this was not a timed challenge. There's no particular time necessary to accomplish this, but this was what I consider to be a gated challenge. Certain things had to be discovered and understood in a specific order most of the time in order for them to gain any real traction in solving the problem of the warp drive. And they did really well. There was a lot of improv, bringing in lots of Star Trek technobabble and ideas from episodes they'd seen, and we got a lot of very quick resolution and quick motion in scenes. So what that meant was we were very quickly able to discuss and role play through what the problem is and its effect on the scene, move quite organically to a role, and then we would stop. We would step completely out of character, step mostly out of game, and I would explain how the mechanic works, because this is a mechanic that we're going to be using all the time, right? So everyone was aware that this is something that they should be comfortable with. So we needed to look at how momentum was spent. We needed to look how die pools are formed, how target numbers are identified, and that sort of stuff. Lay it all out plain, and then practice. So that's what we did. And then we got back into the role play, built it up again, and moved on to the next challenging event. And with each challenging event, I focused less and less and less on what the mechanics were, and more and more and more on what the role play was, and the group followed suit. Now, we didn't exactly mesh in terms of tone. There were four of us present in that session. Two of us seemed to agree with what tone we wanted from Star Trek, and the other two seemed to agree with what tone they wanted from Star Trek, but these two tones definitely did not match. There's more of a slapstick and comedy on one side, and more of a humor arises from the situation side on the other. So we will find our middle ground as we play. And as we talk more and more about Star Trek, as we bring in more and more examples, like this particular scene was like a scene in an episode that I remembered now after we played it, blah, blah, blah. Once we start talking about the culture of play and the culture of the content of the actual license of Star Trek, we will find our way. So I'm not particularly concerned about that, but it was something to note how characters, character names, and situations were approached by the different members of the group. So once this, not exactly rivalry, but once this dynamic was set up between the bridge crew and the engineering crew trying to solve this problem, then we were getting pretty close to the end of time we had available for the session. And so the next thing took place. I wanted to make sure that our XO, who is a Betazoid, was able to use his telepathy power for something interesting. And I wanted to have some kind of threat, some kind of hint about things to come. And I'd done this in two ways. I did a little bit of social engineering prior to the session. I started talking about Romulans a lot prior to the session, and you know, the deadly weapons that they have in Starfleet battles, and how these are represented in the original series, and blah blah blah. And I got Lawrence pretty worried about the Romulans. And I think through most of the session, he's wondering, you know, where are the Romulans going to happen in this? And he knows that the course that they're following is taking them near some star bases along the neutral zone. So there are all these hints there that the Romulans are going to be important. Well, the session closes out with a mysterious sensor ghost, and the sensor operator really isn't able to track it down, but he feels like a ship is mirroring their movements. There's been more than enough examples of this through the history of Starfleet that I think this is something that they have been taught. The date that we've settled on is 2378. It's after most of the main events were finished with the Dominion War. This is settling into the background, and the Romulans, I have decided, are, although in an alliance of convenience as a result of the Dominion War, they were manipulated into it, and, you know, well, life as a Romulan still has its own particular requirements, and they need to expand. Well, if they expand toward the Federation, this is a problem, so they're expanding the other way, and that's where our campaign is set, on the far side of the Romulan Star Empire, out in what's still basically listed as unknown space. So it's another one of those 5-year exploratory missions, but this one has the boundary of the Romulan Star Empire. And what have they been doing? Who have they discovered out there? Who have they been enslaving, oppressing, and taking advantage of, and this sort of thing? And can the light of the Federation matter to those worlds that are discovered out there? So all these seeds are planted in the minds of some of the players. When are the Romulans going to matter? So this sensor ghost, people are aware. So we go to alert, we bring people to the bridge, and we start doing what we do, getting ready for them. And the ship, this sensor ghost, they decide is cloaked. And the XO, having been through training, decides he knows how he wants to interrupt the cloak. And so they prepare a special photon torpedo to give a tachyon pulse, and all the rolls for this are processed. And this is where we get some really great character challenge, because our medical officer, the way that his life path went, it was 50-50 whether he could have gone into security or into medicine. And so he kind of opted to have started out in security, but had a series of life-altering events, including the loss of an arm, which drove him away from that side of Starfleet and toward medicine. He doesn't want to be involved in conflict. But we're on a crew, or we're with a crew of, as Kirk would say, babies. Right? All the senior officers are gone. We're a boatload of junior officers, and here's this Romulan threat. So he's called to the bridge. He has to run the security console and be the tactical officer, which is challenging his values and putting him under a great deal of stress. So he prepares the tachyon pulse photon torpedo. They launch it and reveal the craft, and they're ready to slam it with photon torpedoes. They're not taking any chances. The phaser batteries are being armed, and there's a lot of tension, and I reveal it's a runabout, and they have been duped into thinking that this was a Romulan craft, and this was a part of their Shakedown Cruise to test their mettle as a crew. They're a more advanced version of the Kobayashi Maru test. And that's where the episode ends, which got me a lot of interesting commentary from Lawrence as the XO. How could I do that? Well, we almost blew up the runabout and whatnot, so I enjoyed that as well, and hopefully he did, and the other members of our crew. Now, when we play again, we will be advancing time a little bit more. The final tests to the ship will have been completed. The ship is now the way it's going to be until its next refit, and they're going out on their mission, tracking along the neutral zone until they get into unknown space, and that's where our second session will start. I'm not sure if all 5 crew members will be present or if some of them will be present, but I will let you know how things go when we get there. So, to sum up, I've really been enjoying the system, and I've been enjoying comparing this iteration of the system to what's in Conan and what's in Mutant Chronicles. It really has been interesting to see how Modiphius is taking the idea of generic and packaging it for these different licensed properties. I'm looking forward to trying Star Trek. This is something that I haven't done in all my years of gaming. I haven't really done a Star Trek game. I've set up Prime Directive a couple of different times and played it a little bit, but Prime Directive is the Starfleet Battles role-playing game. It's not exactly Star Trek, is it? So, and it's also not the way this game approaches it, with the idea of creating a TV episode. So, all that stuff, that's all positive. I like the group of people that we're playing with, and I'm looking forward to finding that common ground where we're all bringing Star Trek to the table in the same way. And I guess if there's something I could change, it would be the book itself. I really like the content of the book, but my players are starting to laugh because very often I say, I hate this book, because it's not the easiest thing to use, and unfortunately it is still full of errata, and it's not the easiest thing to read, either in PDF or in print. So, if there is ever a second edition of this game, I really hope that it's taken completely apart and put together in a way where it can serve its purpose more readily. Like I said, I really like the content, and I'm really liking the experience of play. I have no issues with the game. I have no issues with the content that's in the book. It's the way that it's in the book that is frustrating. It's difficult to find things. It's difficult to find things again. The index, either in PDF or in print, just doesn't quite go deep enough to make it easy to find things. Things aren't really where they should be. A lot of things are divided when they should be together, and so on and so forth. So the book itself is unfortunately one of the hurdles that a new group has to get over in order to play the game. Once you've done so, I'm finding it staying in memory pretty well, and it's not a heavy system to run at the game table. I don't find that I have to keep going back to the core book very often, if at all. Much less than I did starting Star Wars, for example, which is kind of funny. So, like I say, if there's one downside, it's the actual layout of the book. But everything else is a very positive experience, and I look forward to being able to do more of these recaps as our 5-year mission begins to unfold. And hopefully, you'll enjoy traveling along with us.